usually my advice would be you want to ask them point blank about their medical histories, and you get settled with it. So are you seeing a psychiatrist? Are you seeing a doctor? Are you seeing a psychiatrist? Ask a bunch of other unrelated questions. Are you seeing a psychiatrist? More unrelated questions. What medications are you currently on? And you can kind of trip by separating it out like that. A lot of times you'll get somebody who will list psychiatric medications that you can then research and go, oh, that's what that's for.
Right.
Without them connecting that you're saying they're crazy. And it's never good to outright call somebody crazy. I have had cases where I'm like, okay, this person's just mentally ill. And usually what I'll just say to them is I won't say you're insane, go away. I'll usually say, I think you would be better served by going to talk to a psychiatrist before you speak to me, just to rule out all possibilities. The other thing to keep in mind that I've seen from time to time as well is just because you're mentally ill doesn't mean you don't have a demon in your house.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I've looted a case in Rhode Island with a man who was obsessive compulsive on an epic level. This guy was a very big guy in microbiology, and every day when he'd have something to eat, he had charts he kept on the wall. He would write what he ate and the exact molecular composition.
Wow.
That's cool that he was that smart of a guy, but that's kind of obsessive. And he, in general, the way that he talked, it was very clear there was all sorts of issues with this guy, but he really had a demon.
Wow.
It's not an either or case. And then a lot of the times what I do, because when I walk into somebody's house and they say they have a demon, I don't assume they have a demon. I don't assume they don't have a demon. I'm going and I'm doing the same things that normal ghost hunters do. I'm going to do EVPs. I'm going to do photographs. I'm going to just sit in the dark and see what happens. And
right.
I've always had the rule, and Lou has the rule. It's like, to believe that the house is haunted, I need to see it. Even if one of my other investigators says they saw something, I give that weight because I wouldn't be working with these people if I didn't trust their opinions. But it's like,
right, of course.
I want to see it with my own eyes.
Right.
There's also, and I don't want to go into great detail about this because it's a very controversial thing in the paranormal community, and two, it's one of the biggies on the list of things that people should not go playing with. Right. But in all else fails, if I'm really on the fence and not sure about a case and the situation warrants it, there's always provocation. Which will make it do something. But, I actually, full disclosure, I just was involved in the end of finishing a case last night with clergy. And because it had been going on for 30 years and kept hiding itself and seeming like it was gone and coming back. So finally, the bishop, in fact, went through, did what they needed to do, and then I went in, and it's like, okay, everybody out, and I did my thing to make sure it was gone.
Oh my goodness!
Praise God, it is, but
yeah,
sometimes you just gotta push the point and go, okay, let's be sure of one way or another what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, the one case that I was talking about, the woman, mm-hmm. She, she's gone to her church. She's gone to, this person, that person. She had other paranormal groups come in, and, we really just weren't coming up with anything,
Yeah.
And, to me, it just seemed like it was a cry for help, and there wasn't anything there, because and the way we bowed out of it gracefully, okay, was that don't be surprised if she's at Expo, because
I won't.
she will find you, but.
And actually, I have advice for you, and I have advice for people in that situation.
What?
So, one of the most basic things that I do when I go into a house, and oddly enough, I'd say around 80 to 90% of the time, this solves the situation, is go in with find a local priest. Catholics are an obvious choice, but it's always better to find one of the person's own religious faith. And just have them do a house blessing.
Right. Oh, she's had that done before. This woman had everything done, supposedly.
Well, given the psychological nature of it, there's ways of presenting it. But
Right.
well, there's two things you usually have to do, and again, most of the time, this fixes the problem. One is that you do a house blessing and have a member of clergy do it. And the reason to clarify, especially for my listeners, I always say have clergy do this, and people are like, well, why can't I just smudge my own house? And there's nothing wrong with trying to bless your own house, as long as you're not potentially having a problem. The problem you run into is if you have a demon in your house, you don't want to risk the blessing just pissing it off. It's better to have a priest there, because if the manure hits the air turbine, as it were, you want somebody there who can fix it.
Oh yeah.
Um, on the other hand, the other thing you have to do when you're dealing with the demonic is there's what we call grounds. Grounds is the reason the demon's allowed to enter a person's life, and you've got to figure out what that is and resolve it, because most of the time, probably not 99 out of 100 cases I deal with, when you boil it down, somebody started playing with a Ouija board. And you need to, if that's the case, and I don't know this woman, but instinct and experience suggests that Ouija boards or something like them is probably at the root of this, if it's something legitimate. You need to get the Ouija board out of the house, and you need to convince them to stop using it. And that second one in particular can be the challenging one, because there is a mindset that they get into that is very similar to addiction, and they don't want to stop.
Wow.
But if a house has a demon in it, there is a reason. It might very well be that they moved into the wrong house. The Lutz family that moved into the Amityville house moved into the wrong house, probably. There's some evidence something else may have been going on, which is a long story in and of itself. But most of the time, somebody did something stupid. You've got to figure out what that is, and you've got to fix it. Otherwise,
let me ask you a question. Yeah. We're basically doing the same thing by using a voice recorder.
That's a good.
So, what are we opening up? You know what I'm saying? We have control over it.
That's a good question, and it's actually something that the exorcist I work with and I talked about not long before he died. Because I've had that question raised to me before, and for that matter, I've wondered about it myself. There is a difference. And one, let me be clear. Anybody out there listening in who thinks their house is haunted, I do not recommend that you do EVP in your own house. That's like EVP rule number 1. Don't do it in your own house. Actually, in fact, it's generally a good idea not to investigate your own house. But the biggest difference between EVP and Ouija is EVP is external. It's, okay, we're going to set this recorder down and you're going to talk to the recorder. But a Ouija board, the reality is the majority of the time, unless you get a very powerful spirit, what's going on is it's not the spirit that's pushing the planchette. It's the hands of the person. It's the hands of one of the people doing it. So by
that makes sense. Yeah.
Using a Ouija board, you are voluntarily giving a spirit a degree of control over part of your body. This is a bad idea.
Yeah.
EVP can be dangerous, and it's one of those things you're poking something. And it's the simplest reason I say don't investigate your own house is you're poking something with a stick. You need to know what to do if it pokes back.
Right.
And
no, I've never investigated my own house. Never. I don't have an interest. Yeah. Not at all.
I've broken the rule once or twice, or 10 times. Mostly not my own house, but my mentor's house. But he also knew exactly what to do if everything went sideways. And his house had so much. It's like his house had so much activity in it from the cursed objects he had taken home from cases, and from all the things that he dredged up doing the work that he does, that adding one more spirit to the mix was not a big deal.
Wow. I mean, I have to say, in all the years that we've been working as a group, knock on wood, we have never brought anything home.
You're lucky.
Very lucky. Very, very lucky. But, I mean, just like an EVP session, you have to you have to close it out.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, you have to, you have to demonstrate to them that, hey, look, we have a strong will, and you're going to stay where you are.
Well, it's the thing you run into as well is, and from what you've said, you mostly focus on human spirit cases, since you've only had the one in human spirit.
We've only had one case of inhuman spirit. Yep.
At least my experience is human spirits are less likely to follow you home.
Right.
They do sometimes, and I'm sure your group does things similar. But like whenever I go into a house, I'll usually say the St. Michael's prayer and a general prayer that nothing follow me home.
Right. We do the same thing. Yeah.
And it works pretty darn well. Unfortunately, the reality is that I tend to thumb my nose at a lot of unpleasant things, so things inevitably follow me home. Even more entertainingly, sometimes instead of following me home, it'll start messing with me before I even know the case exists.
Wow.
I'll get a series of weird things happening. Once they do, it's like, oh, I've got a case coming.
Right. Well, it's the same with us, in a way, because, we do our history on a place, and not always in the beginning. We do history afterwards, too.
Naturally.
And, it's just something that you do. It's like putting the pieces of a puzzle together. I mean, basically,
It is, and that's part of what I miss about traditional ghost hunting, being a history buff. The houses I deal with, history is not much of an issue, and it's like I sort of miss just going into a house and sitting around and taking photographs and going home for the day, not having to worry about which member of the clergy I'm going to get involved. That's why the first question, I have people all the time come up to me at events. It's like, how do I learn to do what you do? And my first response is, you're out of your mind. I don't want to do what I do some nights.
Yeah, but you know what? It's got to take a certain type of individual to be able to do that. Just like paranormal investigators compared to just your average person. I mean, we're average people, but from all different backgrounds and things like that. But it takes a special type of person. I think you have to have that mindset as well. To be able to do what we do, for you to be able to certainly do what you do.
This is true. And one of the other funny ways I like to put it, because my traditional training ground for new investigators to see if they can handle it is I'll take them to a cemetery.
Oh, well, yeah.
Because you don't want somebody freaking out in someone's house.
Yeah, but you know what? Cemetery, like, to me, if I died, the last place I would want to hang around is a cemetery.
Well, that's the thing about cemeteries, and this is one of the truths of my work I don't like to say because it's easy to offend people. But the reality is that you don't find as many human spirits in cemeteries as people think.
Right.
Because most human spirits haunt the house they grew up in. The place that they lived with their wife for 20 years. Their wife.
Right. They go back to familiar places.
So you do get human spirits in cemeteries, which are usually one of a couple of types. You'll get. There's a very old legend that seems to have a degree of truth to it. The first body that's buried in a cemetery is the spirit of that person becomes the cemetery's guardian. They have to watch the cemetery, either depending on the version of the legend, until Judgment Day or until the next body is buried, and each person to be buried, each new person to be buried takes up the position.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
So there definitely seems to be some sort of human spirit that serves that kind of purpose in a cemetery.
Right.
You'll also get people that there's a traditional thing, and I'm sure you've experienced it, where ghosts don't understand the fact they're dead. Right. You'll get the ones that either do understand the fact they're dead or really, really don't understand it, and they want to get back into their bodies, which obviously isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
But the other side of what you run into in cemeteries is that whenever a college frat gets a book of black magic and decides to try and summon Satan, they go to the cemetery. Almost every Halloween, kids are out in cemeteries with Ouija boards.
Yeah, I don't get it. Yeah.
People do stupid things in cemeteries.
Oh, absolutely.
It tends to draw other types of spirits there. During the day, cemeteries are usually very, very peaceful. Most cemeteries at night are even very, very peaceful. There are certain cemeteries that you get some unpleasant things. And not all of it's demonic either. I've run into elementals in cemeteries. I've run into fairies in cemeteries.
Oh, wow.
Which makes sense when you think about it, especially with a lot of the nature spirits like fairies and elementals, because cemeteries are usually a little kind of isolated on their own. They often have trees around them. Some of,
Right.
you have that bit of nature away from humans that nature spirits like.
Right, right.
Do you have any other questions?
Not really.
Well, it's 7:35.
I'm sure I will sooner or later, when we come
Yeah, you'll
upon
be
that
seeing me in
case
person
that
soon, and you know how to reach me.
exactly,
But
exactly. Just like people, well, they kid around with us,
yeah,
who are you gonna call? You're gonna call us,
yeah. I've done that joke with friends of mine that dabble in this stuff too, and it's like I have the one friend who's always trying ritual the urban legend stories of how to summon spirits and things like that.
Oh
And
boy.
I keep telling him, it's like, well, if it actually works, this one time, you know who to call.
I know. There's a couple stories, I think, in the folklore book, where, no, actually, I don't even know if it made it in, I don't know if it made it into the book. We had so much material, to put forth, into the book. But, yeah, there's, oh,
I don't know a single writer on the paranormal that hasn't told me that, there are so many stories I just couldn't fit.
right, right. Yeah.
I had a guy
It's
on my
amazing.
YouTube, and then we're going to have him on the show probably, I think, either late October or November, who did a book about the first book was Ghosts of Rock and Roll. And while he was researching that, he found all these stories about country music. So the next book's country music.
Oh, geez. Well, I'm going to tell you, it's not in a book, but I have the photographic evidence in my filing cabinet. But
Mm-hmm.
when my son was, well, he was playing guitar since he was about, I don't even know how old he was. I don't know, around, I guess early teens, right before teens. He owned like 9 guitars at one time,
Wow.
and he had guitar lessons. He started out in school, he had saxophone lessons. Then he graduated, he had drum lessons, and then he decided he was going to play guitar. So, and when my son takes on a project or a hobby, okay, he spares no expense,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and he jumps into it, full force. So he had his guitar, and he says to me the one day, he says you got to see this, he said, and he said I took a picture of it, because who would believe him, okay,
Yeah.
I mean a picture's worth 1,000 words. So he was playing his guitar in his room one night, and you have to understand, well, there was a reflection in his guitar. My husband's the biggest skeptic in the
Mm-hmm.
world, okay? And he's not going to see or he's not going to believe something unless he sees it or it bites him
Yeah.
in the ass. So he says, well, it could have been a reflection from the TV. Yeah, but this wasn't on the TV, okay?
Mm-hmm.
It was a reflection of a woman on the body of his guitar, okay? And if you look at it close, you can see that it has like light color hair,
Mm-hmm.
bangs. You can see all the features. I have it in my file, okay? And we said, okay, couldn't explain how it happened, but think about it, okay? Now, we did a little research. I don't forget how we came upon it, but my son is left-handed,
Mm-hmm.
okay?
Yay,
And they
Southpaws.
make very few left-handed guitars, even to this day.
This is
They make
true.
very few left-handed ones. So he would always, okay, have a Frankenstein guitar, where he, changed the nut on it and changed it over from, a
Flipped it so
right-handed
you
guitar
could
to a
use it. Yeah.
left-handed guitar, things like that. So did Jimi Hendrix.
Yep. I was just actually going to say
There
that.
were there
Hendrix
were
was a left-handed.
you'd be surprised at how many guitarists have done that. And, my son plays left-handed. He does not play right-handed. When he went for guitar lessons, the teacher tried so hard, okay, and it just wasn't happening. So, and he has some actual, authentic left-handed guitars as well, but but like I said, they're far and few between,
Yeah.
and when you do get them, they're expensive. But in any case, I said, okay, I don't know, whatever, the light bulb went on or something, and I started researching Hendrix. Well, it appeared that the face reflection in his guitar, whatever it was, okay, looked like Jimi Hendrix's girlfriend.
Interesting.
So we printed out a picture of her, okay, laid it over this picture that he took from his guitar. It's an exact match.
Wow.
It's incredible.
Not that surprising.
It's absolutely incredible. And how do you explain something like that?
Well, you and I both know how to explain something like that. The
But I'll tell
skeptics
you
aren't
what.
so willing, but
But I'll tell you what. I had a friend of mine help me with this, who's a psychic medium. His, I guess it's his life path numbers.
Okay.
Are the same as Jimi Hendrix's.
Oh, wow.
Interesting. Ooh.
I have a whole file on it, in my filing cabinet. But, things like that, you can't explain them away. You just can't.
How old is your son?
Well, now he's 28, but this had to be, more than 10 years ago.
Well, no, do you know the group that Jimi Hendrix is a part of?
One
of the weirder, well, it's not an actual group in the usual sense, but there's a weird thing with musicians. Jimi Hendrix falls into it. A whole bunch of other famous musicians, going all the way back to the 19th century, I want to say, fall into it, called the 27 Club.
Oh, yeah.
That's like, wait, is he 27 yet?
No, he's 28.
Good.
He's going to be 29.
For my listeners, if anybody's wondering what the devil I'm talking about, there is a number of very famous musicians who died when they when they were 27. The most famous example of which, and well, there was one before him. He's usually thought of as the beginner of the whole thing. Was the blues legend Robert Johnson?
Well, you got Jim Morrison.
Yep.
He was 27. You got Hendrix. Was Janis Joplin 27?
I believe yes.
Yeah, there is quite a few. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, having looked at, they've done statistical studies on it, and there's nothing to it, statistically speaking. They're not, there isn't any higher degree of famous musicians who died when they're 27. It's just that a bunch of them, and especially, do you know Robert Johnson?
No, I'm not familiar with him.
Okay, so Robert Johnson is possibly the greatest blues, certainly one of the greatest blues musicians, if not the greatest blues musician of all time, and arguably the single greatest guitarist ever. I mean, when you ask people like Hendrix or Eric Clapton or other people that are thought of as the greats of guitar, most of them would say that Johnson was. To the point that I want to say when Clapton first heard one of Johnson's recordings, his response is, "Who's the other person playing guitar?" Because Johnson was so good with the guitar, he could make it sound like there were two guitars instead of one, where he could actually play it good enough that the guitar could accompany him singing. Now, where this falls squarely into my domain is that when Johnson first started out, he was a terrible musician. Every report about the guy just said nobody liked him, nobody would pay to see him. And he disappeared for about a year. And he came back and turned into this guitar legend.
Wow.
Now, the story goes that Johnson went out to Crossroads at midnight in Mississippi. In fact, there are two different crossroads that both claim to be the crossroad.
Oh, wow.
He's met by a black man who takes the guitar, tunes it, strums a few chords, and hands it back to him. Now, the traditional version of the legend is that, of course, the black man was Satan, and then Johnson sold his soul for his ability with the guitar.
Right, I sold my soul to rock and roll, yeah.
And if you listen to his music, he did a song called Hellhound on My Trail. He did another song called Crossroads Blues that has a line, "Hello, Satan, it's time to go." But he used satanic, occult imagery in his music. And when he died, he was playing in a juke joint, and somebody hands him a bottle of rum. Now, Johnson had a rule that he'd never drink from an open bottle because you don't know what somebody did to it.
Right,
But
right.
so he refuses it, then he takes it a second time, and he does actually drink from it. And he, over the next 2 days, he starts to hallucinate. He starts talking about black dogs chasing him.
Oh, wow.
And then he dies under very bizarre circumstances. The popular rumor is that he was poisoned by the husband of one of his many lady friends, supposedly with cyanide. The problem being cyanide has a very distinctive taste of apricots that the rum shouldn't have been able to mask.
I thought that was almonds.
Or no, I'm sorry. Amisha's right. It's almonds. But nobody's really sure. And there's 3 different cemeteries in Mississippi that claim to be the place that he's buried. Karen, and for that matter, anybody else who's listening in who's curious, if you guys go to YouTube, you can look up Robert Johnson. You can find a lot of his music. He only did I want to say only the one studio album survived. There's a bunch of really good songs, and they're absolutely gorgeous. And the story's been used in a ton of places. It was the inspiration for Tenacious D and the Pick of Destiny.
Yes.
The TV show Supernatural did an episode based on it. And there's other blues legends and even a few other musicians in rock and in country that supposedly sold their souls as well.
Of course, now I just think of the one Metalocalypse episode where they decide, you know what, let's try something different. So let's try being blues musicians for a while. And at one point, they do the deal with the devil thing. And they actually go through a whole bunch of legal minutia to get out of selling their soul. Instead, he gets a Hot Topic gift card.
I want to remind everyone once again, feel free to call in if you like. The number is 609-807-2492, 609-807-2492. Don't worry, we don't bite. But I think, unless you have any other questions, I think we've covered everything pretty well. I was going to let you go.
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good.
Let you go get some sleep.
I appreciate it, and we're looking forward to having you, at Para X Behind the Veil.
I was about to say plug your event again before you go, but you just did.
Oh, yeah. It's Para X Presents Behind the Veil, and it's Saturday, September 30th from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m., and it's at the Elks Lodge. It's right on Farrington Lake. It's in East Brunswick, New Jersey.
So, yeah, anyone who's in the area who can, I highly recommend coming in and checking it out. And you can hear me talk in person, and I'll be there around to answer questions. A lot of other people that are going to be there. It sounds like it's going to be a huge amount of fun. And you said it's $5, right?
$5 gets you in. There
not
are
a bad day for $5. Well, yeah, there's the psychics and things of that nature. But
yeah, there's psychics. Yeah. The museum's free. The traveling museum is free. That's part of the rest of the the vendors that we have there. There's food and drink available for purchase all day long. The Elks cooks up a lot of food for us, and they actually have a little menu, so I have the menu, for Saturday the 30th. So yeah, it's just about a week away. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll let you go, and then I'll see you on the 30th, Karen. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for coming on. Good night. Okay, everyone, that was Karen Kimmel Timper, the head of the Parax Behind the Veil convention on September 30th. We've got a bit of time yet. Yes, Gene?
Yeah, you're good.
So I was thinking, since we got started on it by talking about Johnson, we'll talk about one of my favorite topics, people who've made deals with the devil.
Oh, wow.
Trusty deals.
Yes, including, of course, we're going to have to talk about Johann Faust, who is... Here's the funny thing that a lot of people have heard the story of Robert Johnson. He's pretty famous, having been the talented musician he was. Many people have also heard the story of Faust, given there's been a play by Christopher Marlowe, a book by Goethe, and a bunch of movies and TV shows that have referenced it as well. Funny thing that a lot of people don't realize, Faust is not the first recorded example of the deal. And now, if you go way, way, way back, You can find things in Greek mythology about people making deals with the gods. Hades makes a couple of interesting deals with Orpheus, for example, about trying to get his dead wife back and things like that. And Hades is by no means an evil god in Greek mythology, and I don't mean to give that impression, but
when people imply that he's basically Satan, it drives me up the wall.
Me as well. And but he's one of the gods that the Greeks didn't talk about a lot. There weren't a whole lot of temples to him. It was actually considered bad. He wasn't considered an evil man at all, but it was bad luck to mention his name. But the very first, at least as far as I can tell, the very first reference to a deal with the devil in the modern sense, actually, no, I'm wrong again. Probably the very, very first one that we refer to the Judeo-Christian devil would be in the Bible, when Satan comes to Jesus and offers him the temptations. They turn this rock into a bread because you're starving. Turn the rock into a bread so you can eat. And Jesus says, man will not live by bread alone. And all the kingdoms of the world, if you bow down and worship me, you shall worship none but the Lord thy God. And all these other events is the prototypical version of it in Christianity. But the first story of somebody actually accepting a deal with Satan is a saint, believe it or not. Saint Theophilus of Adana, or sometimes he's known as Saint Theophilus the Penitent. So Saint Theophilus had been a priest. He was a very pious and very humble man. And he was offered the position of bishop of Adana. But being a very humble man, he turned it down. He said, no, I don't want the position. And they turned around and gave it to his arch rival. This infuriated Theophilus, because, okay, I don't want it, but I don't want him having it either. And the devil offered him a deal. Give me sign over your soul. I'll make sure you get the position. Theophilus agrees. He signs the contract. He gets the position. Now, as time goes on, he eventually comes to regret the fact it's like, okay, yeah, I became a bishop. I'm going to burn in hell for all of eternity. I don't want this. So he prays to the Virgin Mary for 40 days, and the contract appears before him, and he's able to destroy it. And he then becomes renewed, and hence he is Saint Theophilus the Penitent. You have a whole bunch of other stories, of course, going through the Middle Ages. Witches are traditionally supposed to have made deals with the devil.
There's one in the castle where they filmed Hogwarts, where this big, huge circular courtyard of somebody supposedly making a deal with the devil. Devil comes for payment, and now they're eternally chasing each other
around the courtyard.
I
did not know that story. So this is why I bring my fiance on the show with me. Is she's quite smart and she knows some things I don't. And that would be an example. I didn't even know Hogwarts was filmed in an actual castle, to be honest with you. I knew the dining room scenes were filmed at Oxford University, but I didn't know the rest of it was filmed somewhere specific. That's really cool.
There's a couple of different locations they use to make the castle that is Hogwarts.
It makes sense given it's a rather odd castle.
Just the size of it, to come to think of it, it's a pretty big one.
I'm going to come back in a second to the Middle Ages because I want to. We touched on it briefly, so I'm going to get into my favorite types of. It's a little bit about werewolves, and we've already talked about Johnson. I was going to just mention Johann Faust. Faust was a German doctor, and there's actual historical evidence that this guy existed. Now, as far as the history shows, he was an alchemist, and supposedly he sold his soul to the devil, and then he was found torn apart in an alley. And that's, a large part of where our modern idea of the deal with the devil is. The 10 years thing starts coming here. The great playwright Christopher Marlowe, who sadly is not well known because his friend sort of overshadowed him because he was contemporary of William Shakespeare. Although, funny enough, Marlowe was actually a secret agent working for the Queen, believe it or not, as well as a playwright. But he makes a deal with the devil, not Satan, but one of the other devils, Mephistopheles, in return for his soul at the end of 10 years, and he gets women, and he gets magical power, and he gets knowledge, and he gets all these other wonderful things. And then, of course, he's dragged off to hell while screaming to God for forgiveness. And then there's a similar story by Goethe, and there's a couple of other legends here and there.
Of course, now I'm just thinking of watching Linkara's review and people insisting that Mephisto is not the devil. It's like, he's pretty darn close. I mean, look at where his name came from.
Yeah. Which is, of course, a reference to comic books and the much maligned and justifiably so, in my opinion, Spider-Man comic One More Day. I'm going to have to try and get Linkara on here.
Yes. It had such a good idea, and it did not know how to do it properly.
But we've got a little bit of time, so why don't we talk werewolves? I like werewolves. My great passion is actually vampires. But the thing that you run into with vampire legends, or werewolf legends for that matter, or any other types of legends, people today, when you read fiction, you have, okay, vampires are one thing, and werewolves are another thing, and witches are something else. In the original folklore of the Middle Ages, it's not that simple. You'd have the exact same story, and one time they call it a witch, and one time they call it a werewolf, and another time they call it a vampire. For that matter, in a lot of parts of Eastern Europe, when a werewolf died, he became a vampire.
And then, of course, when you throw Fae into it, it
gets even weirder.
There are all sorts of what the hell.
We will be doing a whole episode on fairy because they're a fascinating subject into themselves. But here's a really interesting idea about werewolves a lot of people don't know. Some people do because apparently it was brought up on the show Penny Dreadful. So in most European werewolf legends, for one, it's nothing like the movies. People usually become werewolves because they decide to and they make a deal with the devil. There are exceptions. In a number of countries, for example, Germany, it's seen as hereditary. There's other places where it's a curse. For example, one of the most colorful of Catholic saints, St. Patrick, yes, the guy we all associate with Ireland, turned a number of druids into wolves for ticking him off. But there's another type of werewolf you find in Italy, Germany, Scandinavia, and a couple of other places, which is really weird, which is sometimes called the Benedonti or sometimes called God's Hounds. They are the good guy werewolves. In every legend I know, in fiction there's lots of good guy vampires, but in the legends of vampires are pretty much all evil. A lot of the legends suggest that they're demonically possessed corpses, although when we have Brian back, we can talk about that more because he's the vampire guy. But in werewolf legends, you do have this idea that there are werewolves who have been given a job by God to hunt evil, specifically witches, because, like I was saying with Karen, they're the 3 harvest days of the year, and supposedly witches and demons drag grain down to hell. And then these werewolves would go down and bring it back. There's an interesting enough account, and if you go to the YouTube page, again, Paranormal Encyclopedia, my former co-host is currently away at law school, did reading of the actual trial transcripts, where the Inquisition was asked to investigate a man who was openly calling himself a werewolf in Litvonia. And this guy explains the absolute confusion of this Inquisitor, because the Inquisitor is like, so are you a werewolf? Yes, I am. The Inquisitor is a little confused because the reality is in most of Europe, so the Middle Ages, being a werewolf was the equivalent of being a witch, and you got burned at the stake for that. It happened a lot in France, with the werewolves specifically. So the Inquisitor goes, so you're in league with the devil? The guy goes, no, he hates me. And the Inquisitor goes, come in? And the guy explains that he had been less than great man, and somebody had come to him and offered him a chance to join this group of the God's Hounds and given him a wolfskin belt, which is another common element of werewolf legends throughout Europe, that would allow him to take the form of a wolf, and then he would, like I said, he'd go down to heaven, he'd fight the demons and the witches and bring the grain back, leaving the Inquisitor with a very nice, pious Christian man who openly says he's a werewolf. So the Inquisitor goes, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to torture you. We're not going to execute you. 1, stop telling people you're a werewolf. But I can't do that because I have to train the next guy. No. You're not training anybody else. Stop saying you're a
I
werewolf.
did not hear that.
You can keep doing this, but I don't tell anybody. Don't let it get back to the church. La 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 la. I'm not listening. And the last thing is, would it kill you to go to church once in a while? And there are other trials that happened in Italy, for example. Funny enough, there's a common legend that's been passed down in the Americas, but part of the legend has since been forgotten, which is what's called a call. Now, sometimes children are born with a bit of their mother wrapped around their face, and it's commonly called the call. What many people know is that a child born with a call is supposed to have the second sight. They're supposed to be able to see spirits. What people don't know is they're also supposed to be this type of werewolf, which in Italy is called the Benendanti. In Italy, you have Benendanti and Melendanti. A Benendanti is a good walker and is a good werewolf and a good witch. A Melendanti is an evil walker and is an evil witch. And the two are constantly at war with each other. And since we're on the subject of the Inquisition...
Yeah, I was just thinking, and not just thinking about how you say you would love to be a fly on the wall during that Inquisition hearing. And it just made me think, there's several things that people would love to be a fly on the wall for, and I'm curious what people's are.
Anyone out there got an opinion? We do have the Facebook. People can ask. You can call again. Give us a call, 609-807-2492. If you got an opinion on what point in history you'd like to have been a fly on the wall for. I've got a lot of them.
Yeah, I was watching one of the Nostalgia Critic reviews. It was for the G.I. Joe movie, and he said he wanted to be a fly on the wall when the line was recorded. Cobra.
A bit of classic childhood for people like me that are old enough to remember it. But it's very interesting, and it's something we'll be hitting on more as the show progresses. A lot of what people think they know of history isn't quite what actually happened, particularly when you get into the Middle Ages. The thing you run into, to get vaguely political, I suppose, is a lot of history, particularly as it's taught in the United States, has a very pro-Protestant feel. Because the thing is, the U.S., I'm not going to say the U.S. is a Christian nation in the sense that most people think, but historically speaking, most American citizens have been Protestants. All but one president for certain was actually Catholic, which would be John F. Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln, they're not really sure what he was. He may not have been Christian, but he was a theist, or at least a deist. He did believe in God. But all the founding fathers were either Protestants or deists that had strong affiliations with Protestantism. So there's a bit of miscommunication on certain things. And one of the big ones is the Inquisition. And one of which the Inquisition was primarily not witch hunters. The Inquisition started before the witch hunts kicked in. And what you run into is up until about the 14th century, the Catholic Church said that witches didn't exist. Because it was believed that to be able to conjure storms and do the things of this nature was power that only God had. To say that some human could do this is heresy. So what actually happened in the early part of the Inquisition's history, and if you didn't know, for the record, the Inquisition is still a thing. Although it doesn't burn people at the stake anymore, thank God. But what they would do is they'd be called in to investigate a witch. They'd then let the accused witch go free, and whoever made the accusation would wind up in prison. The Inquisition absolutely did horrible things. A lot of the worst of it was done in Spain under the Spanish Inquisition, which was really more of a tool of the King of Spain and a political phenomenon as much as it was a religious one. And the witch trials themselves are a very complicated subject. There were about 100,000 witch trials, not in the number of accused witches, that would probably, I'm quite certain, is higher. But in the number of total trials, there was actually only about 100,000 of them, all across Europe through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Reformation. And out of those, only about 30% were ended in a conviction, many of which actually were not executed at all. They were simply banished or charged a fine. Of the ones that were executed, most common, they were strangled to death, drowned, or decapitated. And then it wasn't that they were burned alive, although that did happen Joan of Arc, for example, was burned at the stake, alive. But usually they were killed and then they burned the body for good measure. It's like, just to be extra sure you're dead, we're going to burn you. Which turns up in a lot of folklore, like most vampire legends, for example. You don't just drive a wooden stake through the heart and say, we're done for the done. You drive a wooden stake through the heart, then you go take the body and throw it on a funeral pyre. And that's what ends it. So there's definitely a tradition with fire and getting rid of evil. But you run into things with the Inquisition, particularly in the one I was going to talk about, because I find this interesting. It's an example of how history gets distorted, which is the trial of Galileo Galilei. People have a massive misunderstanding of the trial. People think Galileo was. I've actually had a science teacher who had taught in high school for many years tell me that Galileo was persecuted by the Inquisition for teaching that the world was round. No. For a start, people have known that the world was round for about 2,200 years at least.
And at that point in history, hey, we've known or at least had some inclination since about ancient Greece.
Any culture that sailed across the horizon knew that the Earth was round, because the reality is, and if you ever meet a flat earther and you want a simple proof that they're wrong, watch a ship sail over the horizon. The ship will gradually disappear, starting at the bottom, reaching the top of the mast, exactly like you would expect on a round or globe Earth. We're actually in ovoid spheroid. I don't forget the technical term. We're not in a perfect sphere. Is the point? But it was a settled thing by then. I mean, even Columbus and everyone in Columbus's time was well aware the Earth was round. Columbus was what everyone was worried about. Is Columbus was massively wrong about the size of the Earth. If he hadn't found the New World, he would have starved to death before he ever reached the Indies.
Still an interesting what-if story of it. If the mutiny actually did happen, like 2-3 days before they found the Americas?
Yeah, his crew nearly mutinied on him because they were low on food, low on water. Then found Asia like he thought they would. It was just endless sea. And luckily, they ultimately found the New World and did some unpleasant things. Well, luckily for the sailors who did not starve to death. But with Galileo, what he said that got him in. Well, what he said and where the thing centered around was, he said that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, the sun was. We all now know that, of course, that the sun is the center of the solar system. The center of the universe is another matter entirely. But what's interesting about this is that Galileo didn't get in trouble for saying that the sun was the center of the universe. He did say that from the first start, he isn't the first guy who said it. Before Galileo, there's a guy by the name of Copernicus. Copernicus said the exact same thing, and nobody cared. Copernicus got in no trouble for any of his publishings. Now, Galileo comes along, and he does a number of experiments with telescopes. He's famously cited as the man who invented the telescope. That's not actually true. But he notices moons of Jupiter. He notices the way that shadows move. And he said he has new evidence for the sun being the center of the universe. And he starts publishing that. And the first reaction the church has was a very polite and friendly, why don't you come over to Rome and come to the Vatican and let's talk about your evidence. And he did. And he was very well received by a number of Jesuit scholars. The Jesuits are a very scholarly and intellectual order within the Catholic Church. They have a number of scientists both then and now. In fact, fun fact, it was a Jesuit priest who would ultimately suggest the Big Bang. But everybody liked him, including the cardinal at the time, and I forget his name is Cardinal, but he would eventually become Pope Paul V, which is the man under which Galileo was famously persecuted. Him and Galileo become close friends. Galileo goes back to Europe and decides to start publishing his theory as if it's proven fact, which then and now is a big no-no in science. You don't publish something that's unsubstantiated as if it's absolutely settled, particularly because at the time, the main theory of the universe was not what everybody thinks. Most people didn't think that they thought that the sun orbited the Earth, but they thought everything else in the galaxy orbited the sun, which would have explained at least some of Galileo's observations. There's also one observation Galileo made, two observations Galileo made that were factually wrong, and most school children know this. One is that he was convinced that the idea that was prominent at the time, that the moon caused the tides, was wrong. He thought the sun was the cause of the tides, and he thought that proved him right. The suns do actually have an influence on the tides, but every school kid knows that the main cause of the tides is the moon. The other thing is that he thought that there was a Jesuit priest at the time who published a paper saying that the comets they were seeing were actually further out than the orbit of the moon, and Galileo thought that was absurd, that comets didn't exist at all, they were just an optical illusion. Finally, what happens is not that the church gets angry with him, but the secular scientific community goes to the church. You got to do something about this guy. He's going against church doctrine. He's saying that you're wrong. He's saying that we're wrong. He doesn't have the proof he needs yet. So finally, the Inquisition gets involved, and basically they go to him. Here's what we want you to do, and by want we mean this is what you're going to do. We want you to write a book and just present the two sides fairly. Present the evidence. And he goes, okay, and he writes a book known as Dialogue Concerning the Chief Two World Systems, in which he structures the book as an argument between two individuals. One he calls the academic, and the other one he calls the fool. You want to take a wild guess which position's the academics and which one's the fool? So mistake number one is he calls everyone who doesn't agree with him an idiot. Mistake number two is he then proceeds to quote a number of important Jesuits, cardinals, and Pope Paul V, his own friend, out of context as in support of the fool. This is the point that he's finally made a big enough fool of himself that he gets invited to talk to the Inquisition again. The Inquisition finds him guilty of being grossly suspect of heresy. He was not actually declared a heretic. He is sentenced to life in prison, and the one book, the Dialogue Concerning the Chief Two World Systems, is banned. The next day, after an intercession by his daughter, who was a nun, as I understand it, his life in prison was commuted to house arrest. So they basically told him, go back to your palatial mansion and live there, and don't leave unless somebody escorts you. The book was indeed banned, but he wasn't, and this is important, he wasn't banned from continuing his research at all. In point of fact, while he was under house arrest, he would proceed to write the two new sciences, which is what cements him in history as the grandfather of physics. And the other side of this is he didn't stop publishing the dialogue. He kept publishing it in countries that were less strongly Catholic. The Catholic Church entirely knew about this. They didn't do it. They didn't care. They went, okay, you're doing what we told you not to. We're going to ignore it. But it's the interesting thing. And anyone who's interested in this, and I will definitely say, and it was Drew and I's mantra when we were doing YouTube, and it's my mantra here: don't take my word for things. Check sources. Whenever anyone tells you something, I highly recommend that people check the sources themselves and educate yourselves instead of blindly trusting. There's a wonderful book I would recommend called Galileo's Daughter. Now, I mentioned that Galileo's daughter was a nun. During this whole brouhaha, Galileo corresponded back and forth with her about what was going on. A couple of years ago, they published these letters as Galileo's daughter. Instead of reading a history book that's going to tell you what happened, go read what he said happened. It's a little different than people think. And again, like I said, don't take anyone's word for it blindly, including mine. Aside from the fact that I by no means know everything, I do make mistakes. But you will find, and we'll talk about more aspects of it as the show goes, but there's a lot of the history that we think we know that isn't true. And I'm not going to get in, and don't misunderstand me in this. I'm not going to start getting into, who really shot JFK and other conspiracy theories. But there are things that are documented and verified that actually happened that many of which involve the paranormal that either we don't know, that aren't taught about, or taught to some degree wrongly. Another fun one I always talk about is what is it called? No, not Rainbow. Rainbow's the other thing. Stargate, Project Stargate, which was an effort by the CIA to recruit psychics to spy on the Russians during the Cold War. There's a movie called Men Who Stare at Goats that was inspired by this project. And as bizarre as it is, it's some of the funny things about it. You know, the CIA was very tongue-in-cheek about the whole thing. They wound up calling the operatives Jedi at various points.
I want to say Stranger Things was also loosely based off that.
I believe that to some extent, and I think a couple of other experiments. Another real interesting one that is called MK Ultra, which is very popular with conspiracy theorists, and it's absolutely factual. There are a series of experiments that the U.S. government conducted at a number of major universities across the United States in mind control. And they used LSD, they used hypnosis, they used a number of other psychoactive drugs.
From my understanding, much without the people knowing that that's what they were being given.
Entirely without the consent of actually, this case, the whole idea that we have today of informed consent at any type of treatment that you're going to give a patient, you have to inform them of, largely comes out of this becoming public.
You could stay on the air if you want, because there's no other show. I have to pick my daughter up.
Okay.
So it's up to you. You can go off now, and I'll leave. And then you can leave, or you can stay on. Your choice. I'm giving you the time because there's nobody else here, so just take advantage of it.
I'd say let's keep going.
But if there's calls, I can't get them through because I'm not here.
Can she?
I don't really know what I'm doing.
Is it hard to put the calls through?
You just push Skype.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you get any calls.
Just keep an eye on it and hit Skype.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to let me keep going, I'll keep going.
No, keep going. That's fine with me. That's why I said you can do it. I don't have a problem with that. So when they call, you just click on the button that says okay, and then it's already set up, so you don't have to do anything. All right. I'll be right back.
Okay, and I'll give the
right
number
down the street.
Okay, no problem. We won't set anything on fire, we promise.
Please not. Please don't.
Since we do still have this set up, I'll give the number again, 609-807-2492. I'd love to have somebody call in. But it's okay if you don't. I could keep going, trust me. But yeah, Ultra is funny enough because as I understand it, and I'm remembering something I read a long time ago and possibly second or third hand, so I may be wrong. But as I understand it, when the famous counterculture guy Timothy Leary found out about MK Ultra, he immediately requested to become part of it because hey, free LSD. But the thing is, it was a real thing, and the general that was in charge of it, I don't remember the man's name, wound up when he realized that Congress was going to get wind of it and was all going public. He made a deliberate effort to destroy thousands of documents, and he wound up destroying about 30,000 documents about the whole thing, but he didn't destroy enough of it, and eventually would become public knowledge that we'd done these crazy experiments into mind control, violating all kinds of laws. Interestingly enough, there's a whole other series of other experiments the government's done that they don't talk about. Tuskegee is pretty well known, where they infected African American men with syphilis, telling them it was actually a vaccination. There's one of my favorite preaching points, as it were, which is called Operation Paperclip, which is when the U.S. government hired Nazi war criminals. In fact, a man by the name of Werner von Braun was behind both the man who designed the V-2 rocket for Nazi Germany and the man who designed the Saturn II rockets that put the first U.S. satellites into orbit. And he was one of the nicer people involved in Paperclip. There were much more horrible men who were chemical and biological weapons researchers and SS officers and things of that nature that did these kinds of things. And yeah, the order to do all of this, which is famously become known as Operation Paperclip, was signed by Harry S. Truman. He did stipulate in the order that no one involved could either be a not member of the Nazi Party nor could they be anyone guilty of war crimes, since that ruled out everyone that the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services, what would one day become the Central Intelligence Agency. Everyone they wanted was members of the Nazi Party, and most of them were war criminals. So they created fake backgrounds for these people, where they weren't members of the party, weren't guilty of war criminals, or if they were members of the party, it was very minimal. And that's why it's known as Operation Paperclip. The other one I find very funny is UFOs, which are, of course, a huge topic. And people think there's a government conspiracy to hide them. There is actually there is evidence of a government conspiracy, if you will, about UFOs, and it's the exact opposite of what most people think. See, what you got to remember is that while there are UFO reports going back further, they really start with the Second World War, particularly with a lot of the fighter pilots. And then they pick up and become more prominent during the Cold War era. Now, what we have going on during the Cold War era is that the United States government and the Soviet Union is conducting all sorts of bizarre experiments on experimental aircraft. The U.S. government's using a bunch of balloons, not weather balloons as famously said with Roswell, but actually balloons with carrying espionage technology to spy on the Russians. Crashed in a couple of places. There's a school of thought that may actually be what landed at Roswell. So the government wants to cover all of this stuff up. So what is it going to do? Well, the UFO craze was big at the time. So they're like, we know. Blame it on aliens. There's definitely evidence the U.S. government used the cover story of aliens to cover up very mundane experiments that were going on. There's at least one school of thought that suggests that the Roswell incident itself may have been one of these cover-ups, because when you trace it back, it first starts with a sheriff who was actually a retired Air Force captain. And it doesn't take a huge leap of logic to say, well, maybe they're just covering up something that may even have been very sinister. I mean, maybe it was something they were doing with Operation Paperclip people, but maybe it was something earthbound. Because if you haven't noticed by now, I like to do slightly random segues when I do the show, unless I'm trying to focus on a specific topic. I will say, in terms of UFOs, I believe that most of the things that people see that they call, keep in mind, an unidentified flying object. The first and key word in that, in my opinion, is unidentified. I think a lot of what people think are UFOs are identified. They see an airplane fly by and they don't recognize it. They see experimental aircraft. They see weird astronomical phenomenon. They even may occasionally see swamp gas. That is actually a thing. But I think that's one possibility of what's going on. I also think, quite honestly, that there are at least some cases, and there are definitely some cases, and even the U.S. government Operation Blue Book, or Project Blue Book, excuse me, which was the government's official investigation into UFOs, admitted that there's a certain percentage of cases that they don't have a ready explanation for. And I believe, there's probably a whole bunch that the explanation is classified, but there's definitely a percentage that can't be easily explained. I don't necessarily, while I believe that there's life elsewhere in the universe, I don't necessarily believe that life has ever come here. If you listen to a lot of, when I say this, many of my friends get very annoyed. They'll start giving me speeches about, well, how can you be so arrogant to think that there's no life elsewhere in the universe? Again, no, it's not that I don't believe that. It's not that I believe we're alone in the universe. It's some logistical problems in terms of physics with life getting here from anywhere else. The nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is 4.2 light years away. So traveling at half the speed of light, and the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. So just half of that, which is completely beyond any technology we currently have, it'd take you over 8 years to get here from Proxima Centauri. I mean, if you could basically violate Einstein's theory of relativity and go at the speed of light, it's still a 4-year trip each way. I'm skeptical that and that's all assuming that Proxima Centauri has intelligent life around it. So I do think there's life in the universe. I think there's probably even intelligent life in the universe. I'm unconvinced it comes here. This isn't to say I think that people who see UFOs are crazy or wrong. Because if you read UFO accounts, and then go back 100 years, and read stories of people's encounters with fairies. Go back a couple of 100 years before that, and there are very similar stories that are being told about demons. Hundreds of years before that, the stories are told about the gods. Now, if you ask a ufologist, and I've asked many, most of them will suggest that the gods, the demons, the fairies were all just the ancients' ways of trying to understand UFOs. I propose an alternate argument. I propose that what we think of as UFOs is our attempt to understand something else. Fairies, demons, gods. To me, that argument is equally valid. Especially because if you look at UFO phenomenon, a lot of it doesn't act like physical objects are supposed to act. You know, aliens during abduction scenarios walk through walls. You could make a Clarke's third law argument there, because of course Clarke's third law, if you don't know, Arthur C. Clarke, famous science fiction author, said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So you could make that argument that the technology is so advanced they just can do this. But when you add something else in that's very interesting, and this isn't talked a lot in popular culture, although ufologists are certainly aware of this, but after a UFO sighting happens, it's not uncommon for people to experience poltergeist phenomenon, haunting phenomenon, to have objects moving around on their own accord, and hear weird noises and things like that. And what makes this interesting to me is that the UFO's gone. You know, they're not seeing the UFO anymore, but they're still having paranormal phenomenon happening in their house, which seems to speak against the idea of it being advanced technology, in my opinion. But if my postulate is correct, that you're dealing with some kind of spirit phenomenon, now we may have an explanation for some of this. Now, I'm not saying it's all this. I think there's... I'm very, very skeptical, but I will allow certainly the possibility I may be entirely wrong. And some of it may be alien life. If it is, I'm inclined to believe that it's a mixture of the two, not an either-or situation. But that's my personal opinion on the subject. And it occurs to me, since we still have time to kill and still no one's calling in, you guys are making me feel unloved out there. And to get on to something I should have talked about last week, which is the different types of spirits. Because you hear me talking about, and I already explained the basic idea of demons and devils. But why don't I talk a little bit about angels, elementals, fairies, and the other wacky thing you'll hear me talk about from time to time. So, modern Christian theology says there are angels and there are demons, and that's it. More open-minded Christians will go, there are angels, there are demons, and there are human spirits, and that's it. My personal experience and traditional Christian theology, and for that matter, non-Christian theology, because pagans and things like this say it too, is the spirit world is infinitely more complicated than that. So you have angels. I've encountered angels. Angels are messengers of God. In fact, the word angel comes from the Greek angelos, which translates into English as messenger. The original Hebrew name for angels, which is malachim, also is messengers. For a bit of an English lesson, or a Hebrew lesson, I should say, the suffix "I am" in Hebrew indicates plural. So when people say cherubs, that's technically incorrect. Cherub is singular, cherubim is plural. But yeah, the main job of angels, and angels are definitely a show unto themselves is that they're messengers from God. They come to Earth to tell people things. They come to Earth to protect people. They also come to Earth to judge people. When you read, Revelation, or when you read Exodus, when God's angry, he doesn't usually act directly. He sends an angel to do things. It's an angel of the Lord that kills the firstborn sons of Egypt. It's angels that unleash the various judgments of Revelation. It's angels doing all these various things. There's an argument that's certainly made both in Judaism and Christianity that actually this angel of the Lord that they keep talking about is actually God. But there's also opinions on it are extremely divided. Now, aside from angels and demons, which most people are probably pretty familiar with because they're pervasive in modern culture, let's talk about elementals and fairies. Elementals are an interesting one. There's a school of going back to the Middle Ages and going to Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, some of the great magicians and some of the theologians of the Middle Ages. There's this thought that before they created angels and demons, God created these beings we know as elementals. There's traditionally 4 types of elementals. There are fire elementals, which are often called salamanders. There are air elementals, which are known as sylph. There are water elementals, which are known as undine. And there are earth elementals that are known as gnomes. And no, in this older versions, they don't look like Santa Claus. They're not the guys you put in your garden. But the idea in the Middle Ages certainly was that elementals were given the job by God to watch over the natural world. My personal limited experience with them is that's pretty much what they do. Angels and demons and ghosts, for that matter, interact with humans a lot because angels and demons are here to tempt or to guide us. And ghosts were originally humans, so they have a vested interest in us. Since elementals' job is to protect the natural world, they only care about us when we start messing with the natural world. The bad news of which is we do a lot of messing with the natural world. It's called pollution. Usually if you have an elemental show up in someone's house, and it does happen, what you're running into is that it's pissed off that somebody upset the natural balance. The one exception to this, and this is really interesting, if anyone out there listening is a fireman or knows a fireman, and if you know a fireman, feel free to ask them. I have from time to time. Ask them about how fire acts, particularly how it'll act in a burning house. And they'll tell you fire tends to behave almost like it's a living, intelligent thing. It acts bizarrely. Firemen see a lot of weird stuff inside those houses. Now, of course, there are there are the salamanders I mentioned, the fire elementals. Now, I tend to think that we pollute the water, we pollute the air, we pollute the earth. On the other hand, our society is all about the fires. I drove to get here and look at my car. Cars are internal combustion engines. They run on fire and flame and heat. We use heat and flame in so much for our society. I'm inclined to think that a lot of the fire elementals are destructive by nature because fire is generally a destructive element. But they're not necessarily malevolent towards humans. They just like to play in our creations, and unfortunately when a house catches fire, you have a whole lot of fire and they're interested. Elementals are very old, certainly, and they're very powerful. And when they're pissed off, you've got a real problem. They're also, because they at least seem to, they're not demonic. They don't like humans, but they're serving a purpose. And because they're not demonic, they're very difficult to get rid of. Angels are, of course, of the other types of spirits, angels are completely impossible to get rid of because they're working for, a holy angel is working for God. You can't make it go away unless God wants it to go away. And if God wants it to go away, it'll go away on its own. But another really interesting one that we keep alluding to and probably wind up talking more about next week, and when I get off this particular tangent, I'm going to plug next week's guest because he's a good friend of mine. and an excellent author, but is fairies. Now, fairies are a popular thing and have been pretty much since the Victorian period. And everybody has an idea of what fairies look like. They're cute. They have little butterfly-type wings. They're usually female in a short, skimpy dress. And yes, I'm very deliberately describing Tinkerbell. But if you go back into actual, if you want an idea of how fairies actually behave, pick up a copy of the Brothers Grimm. Read it sometime. I actually recommend this in general. It's a really cool book and a very interesting read. The thing to understand if you don't know this about the Brothers Grimm, and I strongly suspect we're going to get into them a lot more in November when we have my friend Lilith on, is the Brothers Grimm were not, well, they were storytellers, obviously, but they weren't just storytellers. They were folklorists. They were traveling around Germany collecting these stories that people believed actually happened. So yeah, this isn't just, when you look at Hans Christian Andersen, who's of course famous for The Little Mermaid and a few other stories of the sort.
Okay, we're back.
Welcome back.
Well, you can cut it anytime you're ready.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me finish the train of thought and
No,
promote
that's what I'm saying.
the guest, and then I'll get off.
No problem.
Unless you want to let me keep going.
Well, I tried. I need 2 hours. See.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm not complaining. I'm very happy. So but when you get Hans Christian Andersen, a lot of the stuff he wrote, he just made up out of his own mind. He was a very creative man. Grimm mostly relied on actual folklore mythology. Now, yeah, again, fairy, and this is a conversation for another days to wrap things up. But fairies are actually fairly unpleasant creatures. They kidnap people. They eat children. They're murder. Real quick, just go on YouTube, on Wikipedia, and read the story of the Red Cap. You'll get what I'm saying. But I'm going to wrap things up for the night. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. It has, as always, been a pleasure talking with you all. I hope you've enjoyed listening to Karen and listening to me go on my tangents. Please tune in next week. Again, it will be Thursday from 6:30 to 7:30. We will be having my good friend, author Patrick Thomas on. Patrick is the author of Murphy's Law, Hell's Detective, Soul for Hire, Hex by Darkness Curse. Soul for Hire, Greatest Hits, and Hex by Darkness Curse are his two most recent books, and we'll talk about those. He does the urban fantasy thing of fantasy stuff in the modern world. His main series we'll talk a lot about is Murphy's Law, which is the pub in New York run by a leprechaun. He's a great guy. He's a lot of fun, and that's just coming up next week. But that's going to be it for tonight. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and have a good week.
Okay, you're clear.